Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and I want to do a discussion topic video about a subject that's been rolling around in my head for a while, and that's basically, why doesn't Nintendo make more powerful hardware? Well, here's why. Okay, so if you're not familiar, and I assume most of you are, Nintendo, especially with the Wii U, has been blasted for not making hardware that's at a competitive level with the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. People are like, why didn't they do that, man? If they had a system that was like the same, then they would have the ability to not only get all the multi-plats on there, but they would have their own first-party exclusives, and they would just dominate over the competition. I mean, I've heard conspiracy theorists say like, oh, it's because Microsoft and Sony pay them to, make their hardware weaker. That way that, they have to go off in a corner and do their own thing. I don't really buy that myself, but here's the thing you guys gotta know about Nintendo. They have a history of never doing that. Ever. Not even once did they ever go, we're going to make the most powerful console in a generation. I know you're looking at this for good reason. It was the most powerful console in its generation, and we will talk about that, I promise. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that they definitely should do that, they should make more powerful hardware, or that they definitely shouldn't have. I'm simply here to tell you why they historically have not done that. But there are just so you are aware, even if you're one of those people who's complaining like, oh, they should make more powerful hardware, you need to understand there are costs that come with that. And that's always been in defiance of what Nintendo does. So to understand that, let's go a little bit back in time here. We'll get in Doc Brown's time machine, and we'll go back to the late 80s. And I'm going to talk about Gunpei Yokoi here. I'm going to basically paraphrase something he said once. Gunpei Yokoi, if you don't know, developed the original Game Boy. One of Nintendo's top engineers, and he was basically asked at one point about the original Game Boy and like why it would use a monochrome screen, why it uses antiquated technology when its competition like the Game Gear and the Lynx and all that were using color screens and all that. And he basically said like, look, we don't do what our competition does. Our competition will put out game consoles that are perhaps cutting edge, that developers don't really understand, they don't know how to utilize. And as a result, they will make mediocre games for a while before they really kind of grit their teeth and get into the hardware and know how to make games for it. And because it's cutting-edge technology, there's more R&D that goes into it. As a result, the game console becomes more expensive. Where he said, what we decided to do was, I said there's nothing wrong with technology that's like a couple years old. We already know how to work with it, and it's old, so it's not even expensive. The result was, the Game Boy came out, yeah, it had a shitty screen, but it was $100 and had an amazing game library that they just got into immediately, and it sold like crazy. Whereas the Game Gear wasn't that way, and it cost like $150, ate your batteries alive. Whereas I think the Lynx was like $200 or something. That was the model they always followed. Was let's go for a quality quantity of games at affordable prices. It makes sense. So maybe you're asking, is their business model antiquated? Maybe they need to change it. Maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. You might be right. I'm not here to make that call either way. But I'm just telling you why they've historically usually worked and why they've historically failed in some instances. They've kind of always followed that model. Almost always throughout their entire history. There's only two exceptions. One is the Virtual Boy, and we know exactly what happened with the Virtual Boy. Not a good move. I'm not going to go into that. And then the second is the Wii U, which, right here. Granted, this is the gamepad, not the console itself, but you get my point. The Wii U follows half of that model. It has a lot of quality titles on it. It really does. I love my Wii U. I think this is an amazing game console, highly underrated by a lot of people. Really, it's fucking awesome. And this is from someone who absolutely detested the original Wii. You can see my video on why I didn't like the Wii right there if you want. But the problem with the Wii U is its price. It's not competitively priced. When you look at its competition, the PS4 and the Xbox One, they're offering you obviously superior hardware, and they're going to have the multiplats. Everyone knows that. I think we've all kind of understand that Nintendo's not going to get those, so they're going to be, once again, dependent upon their first-party games. So it's kind of a tougher sell when you know that that's all that's really coming to it, and perhaps some exclusive titles from developers. So what would make you swallow that pill? Probably the same thing that always made you swallow that pill. Price. See, if Nintendo did a price cut, got it down to $200, I think a lot more of you would be like, okay, I'm willing to bite. And the obvious way to do that is to drop this, the gamepad. Now, I've talked about that before, and people gave me a bunch of hate. They're like, oh, how dare you say they get rid of the gamepad. I'll be honest with you. I actually really like the gamepad. I think it's a really neat concept. It does a lot of things really well, and it's really cool, the idea that you can play games portably on this thing, and you can stream videos on it if you want to. It gives you bonus features in games. If they utilized it properly, hello, DS and 3DS support would be awesome, through like a little Game Boy Player type of equivalent, for the GameCube. A DS adapter type of thing would be awesome. I guess they're doing that with the Virtual Console, but I don't really care about that. My point is, a lot of potential, but it's never going to get utilized. That's just the reality of it. I mean, I think it was Ubisoft just said recently, like, they have made games for this thing that they have not released intentionally because there's just not enough of these things sold. The obvious way to sell it is drop the price and get them out there. And doing that, getting rid of that would solve that problem. Most games support the Pro Controller. I love the Pro Controller. It's very similar to the 360 controller. It's not perfect, but it's a good controller, and most games can use it fully. So there would be some patching required, specifically to the operating system, but it would be totally doable. And then you would once again be right back in there, Nintendo. You would be following your own model again. So now we've come to the point, because I didn't really want to talk too much about how to give advice to Nintendo on the Wii U. Granted, it was unavoidable. We'll come back over here to the Super Nintendo, because I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, like, Adam, that is the system that they did do that once with. They did make the top-of-the-line game console, the best hardware that had all the multiplats. That's true. But it was a historical accident. So to understand this, there's three major points you got to know. First is, well, let's travel back to 1989 here. Again, we're traveling back in time a lot. What happens in 1989? Well, SEGA says, okay, the Master System didn't do very well, so what are we going to do? Let's make a new console, because that was always been SEGA's logic. It was, oh, our hardware's not doing well, let's make a new one. I love SEGA. They were my favorite hardware developer ever, but that was a stupid business model. Anyway, it worked that time. They got the Mega Drive, as it was known throughout most of the world, out. And then they got, eventually, the Genesis in North America. And it did fine. It did really well at first, and ultimately it kicked a lot of ass. But it took 2 more years before the Super Nintendo came out. And my point there, basically in a nutshell, is they had 2 more years of development to make superior hardware. Herp derp, obviously they're going to do it. It's the 16-bit era. It's not like the technology is super complicated. So 2 years of extra development in 16-bit technology is going to yield a lot. I mean, think about how wide of a gap that really is. In more modern times, we can compare the Wii U to the Xbox One and PS4. There's only a year in between those two. Last time we saw a 2-year gap was the Dreamcast versus the Xbox and the GameCube. There's a 2-year gap between those. And what happened there? The Dreamcast ran almost its entire lifespan. So 2 years in the gaming industry is a lot of time. So that, right out of the gate, gave Nintendo all the advantages as far as hardware goes. So, second, we must understand competition. Now, when it comes to modern times, we've been used to, basically since the PS1 dropped, we've been used to having 3 consoles. In some cases 4, briefly in the 6th generation. So there's a lot of consoles involved that can, like, well, this one has the better, this, and this one has the better that, etc. When you have just 2, because that's what you had, the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, you had just 2. One was going to definitively be better at almost everything than the other one. And the one with 2 years of extra development was going to win. The only thing the Genesis had was blast processing. And again, I will remind you, I prefer the Genesis, so don't go calling me a hater on Sega. That would be crazy. They're my favorite game development company of all time. But anyway, so you had others, of course, but they were all commercially irrelevant. You had, unless you were Japanese, the PC Engine was going, also known as the TurboGrafx 16-DOS, was going to not matter. The SNK Neo Geo did not matter. The Atari Jaguar did not matter. The 3DO did not matter. None of them were commercially relevant. They didn't matter at all. So competition was important into that dynamic. And the third point was developers. People often forget, in the wake of the 1983 video game crash, the only console that came up smelling like a rose was Nintendo's Entertainment System. And Nintendo knew that. They had every developer by the balls and were able to tell them, okay, you can develop for our console, but you can't make anything for the Atari 7800. You can't make anything for the Sega Master System. Which is why Atari had to make almost all their own games for the 7800, which is why Sega had to make almost all their own games for the Master System. That policy, which was eventually considered a monopoly, was basically in effect for the first few years of the 4th generation. So for the most part, when you think of the Genesis, almost every game you love on it was made by SEGA, because they weren't really allowed to have much in the way of third-party development. They did eventually get around that. It was eventually dropped, but by that point, it didn't matter. You know, I mean, most of the third parties had stuck with Nintendo because they had no choice. And then when you did see ports, yeah, they were inferior, but that happens because you had 2 more years of development to make this machine. This, again, is the only time that Nintendo ever had a dominant game console as far as hardware goes. And I don't think they're ever going to do that again. Okay, so you're probably wondering, all right, I get it. What's your point? Well, my point is, now that you know that, you have to understand that the Wii U is probably not going to go anywhere. I mean, a lot of people say, like, oh, they should drop the Wii U and then they should replace it with a more powerful machine. First of all, Nintendo has been around. They've been around longer than anybody else in this game. And they remember their competitor, SEGA, who I mentioned before, had a history of just dropping hardware abruptly. They dropped the SEGA CD abruptly, the 32X abruptly, Saturn, and eventually were forced to drop the Dreamcast, just because consumers lost confidence in them. Nintendo knows not to do that. They made that mistake with the Virtual Boy on their own. They're not doing it again. The Wii U does not have to suffer that fate. Again, if they drop this, it does not have to suffer that fate. So you're not going to see a new console from them for a while. I would say the earliest you might possibly see one is 2016, and that's the earliest. Because unlike, people draw really unfair comparisons between Nintendo and SEGA when it comes to the Dreamcast and the Wii U. People say, like, oh, the Dreamcast didn't do well, and then SEGA, they went under and they're out. And, well, I got some news for you. SEGA had almost no money by the time the Dreamcast was dying. I mean, they were a multi-hundred-million-dollar company, which obviously is a lot of money to any individual, but to a major company is not good. And now they're actually a $3 billion company. They're highly profitable, but you never hear about them because they're mostly irrelevant in the West. They make all their money in, like, Japanese pachinko machines. Point is, they're fine now. And Nintendo, now, even though the Wii U is not doing well, is an $18 billion company. That's more than the Sony Corporation. They're fine. They will be fine sitting on... They can afford to sit on the Wii U. Trust me, they'll be okay. They're not going anywhere. But I will say this about Nintendo. I do think that of all 3 of the guys left, Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, they are the only ones that stand any real chance of making another console. And I've said this in a different video about why I think there will not be a 9th generation of game consoles, and I still maintain that. But I do think Nintendo probably will make one. And I'll quickly address the other 2. Sony, I don't think they're going to make a conventional game console. I think, assuming they don't go bankrupt, which is an actual possibility, and if you don't believe me, look it up yourselves, Sony as a corporation is not doing well. PlayStation's doing great. Sony is not. Just look that up if you do not believe me. They might make like a little receiver box that they call the PlayStation 5. And it would basically be a glorified streaming box. You know, it would connect to some server, you pay a fee, you can play a game, whatever. Basically, PlayStation Now is what they might call PS5. And I would not ever support something like that. I think that's awful. And that's the only real console I can see them making. Whereas Microsoft, obviously they have the money, that's not a problem. But I don't know if their future is in gaming, really. We saw what happened with the Xbox One. We saw the world not really receive them particularly well. And I still think their future is more like they want to get into entertainment, business, or video entertainment more so. Granted, Phil Spencer might be changing that. Phil Spencer, I got to give full credit to him. He is doing an excellent job of turning the Xbox division around. He's the only guy who worked there who seemed to understand that game consoles are supposed to have games. But, credit to him. But I'm just saying, I don't know how much interest as a company Microsoft has in continuing to make Xbox stuff. Since, again, the Xbox has like really never turned a profit, which sucks for them. So what I'm saying is, Nintendo is very possible, and I hope I'm wrong about all this, I really do. I hope that they all make more conventional consoles and we enjoy consoles for years. But it's very, very possible that those 2 will bow out, there will be no one else to replace them. And Nintendo, at some point in the next couple of years, will make a new console that, in the most ironic twists of fate, considering everything I've told you earlier in this video, will end up being the most powerful console of all time. Maybe only slightly more than the PS4 and Xbox One, but it would be there, and it would be the most powerful, and that would be very strange. But it's possible. So what I want you to take away from all of this is just try try to understand before you say something like, oh, Nintendo, why don't they just try it all over again? Why don't they just make the most powerful hardware? They have their reasons, and it's generally to your benefit, believe it or not. So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.